December 22nd, 1299. On the plains of Wadi al-Khaznadar in Syria, one of history's strangest scenes was unfolding. Mongol archers stood shoulder to shoulder with Armenian Crusader knights. Georgian cavalry lined up next to Turkish warriors, and commanding this entire coalition was Gazan Khan, a Mongol emperor who had converted to Islam just 4 years earlier. Who were they preparing to fight? The Mamluk army was also Muslim. This is the story of one of history's most bizarre paradoxes. When the Mongols, the same force that had devastated Baghdad and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Muslims, suddenly became the last hope of the Crusades. But was this really a rescue? Or just the final delusion of a dream that had already died? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm really curious to see how far our history community reaches across the globe. To understand why this battle mattered so much, we need to rewind 39 years to another battle that had completely reshuffled the power dynamics of the entire Middle East. September 3rd, 1260, the valley of Ain Jalut, Palestine. Imagine you're one of General Kitbuka's Mongol warriors. For the past 2 decades, you've watched your empire conquer everything from China to Poland. You've seen Baghdad, Islam's greatest city, fall in flames. The concept of defeat barely exists in the Mongol vocabulary. But today, the impossible is about to happen. Sultan Qutuz of the Egyptian Mamluks had done something nobody thought he'd dare. He killed Hulagu Khan's envoys and displayed their heads on the gates of Cairo. That was a declaration of war. And now, 20,000 elite Mamluk cavalry were facing a Mongol force of only 10,000 to 20,000 men. Why so few? Because Hulagu Khan had been forced to take most of his army back to Mongolia after Great Khan Munka died. Imperial politics mattered more than conquest. Kitbuka, a talented Naiman general who followed Nestorian Christianity, was left to hold what they'd taken. The battle was fierce. Mamluk General Baibars used the very tactic the Mongols had employed to defeat countless enemies, a feigned retreat to lure the enemy into a trap. And this time, it worked against the Mongols themselves. As victory tilted toward the Mamluks, Sultan Qutuz reportedly threw off his helmet, shouted, "Wa Islama, oh my Islam," and charged into battle. Mamluk morale exploded. Kitbuka fought to his last breath. When captured, he told Qutuz, "If I die by your hand, I consider it God's will, not yours. Don't be deceived by this victory for even a moment. When news of my death reaches Hulagu Khan, the ocean of his wrath will boil over, and from Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt will tremble beneath Mongol hooves." But that prophecy never came true. Kitbuka was executed. The Mongol army was shattered. And for the first time in history, the Mongol Empire had been decisively defeated in pitched battle. Ain Jalut didn't just save Egypt. It saved the entire Islamic world from Baghdad's fate. But it also did something else. It turned the Mamluks into the Middle East's dominant power and the sworn enemy of what remained of the Crusades. This put the Christian kingdoms of the Middle East in a terrible position. And to understand why, we need to talk about a small but incredibly important kingdom. Imagine you're the king of a small nation sandwiched between 2 superpowers at war. What do? That was the situation facing the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, a Christian nation on the Mediterranean coast in what's now southern Turkey. In 1247, King Hethum I made a bold and controversial decision. He voluntarily submitted to the Mongol Empire, not because he loved the Mongols, but because he understood the mathematics of power. Hethum I undertook an astonishing journey, from Cilicia across Central Asia, all the way to Karakorum, the Mongol capital. Think about that. A Christian king traveling thousands of miles through deserts and mountains to meet the great Khan Munka. That wasn't the action of a coward. That was the move of a pragmatic statesman. And the strategy paid off. When the Mongols attacked Baghdad in 1258, Armenian troops fought alongside them. When the Mongols took Damascus in 1260, Armenia was there. In return, the Mongols protected Armenia from Mamluk and Seljuk attacks. But after Ain Jalut, everything changed. The Mamluks were now the region's dominant power, and they hadn't forgotten that Armenia had helped the Mongols. In 1266, Mamluk Sultan Baybars, the very general who had won at Ain Jalut, devastated Armenia. Cities were destroyed, people were massacred, even Hethum's sons were killed or taken prisoner. For those who criticize Hethum I's decision today, consider this. Without the Mongol alliance, Armenian Cilicia might have been wiped out entirely even sooner. Sometimes in history, there are no good choices, only the least terrible ones. By the late 13th century, Armenia was desperate. Mamluks are attacking from the south, Turks pressing from the west. The Mongols, their only ally, were busy with civil wars and conflicts with other Mongol Khanates. And it was in that desperate context that a new opportunity emerged, not from Europe, but from Persia, where a young Mongol emperor had just converted to Islam and was preparing for a major war. In 1295, Gazan Khan, Hulagu Khan's great-grandson, did something nobody expected. He converted to Islam. Let that sink in for a moment. His great-grandfather had massacred hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Baghdad. He destroyed the House of Wisdom, the repository of Islamic knowledge. He'd killed Caliph al-Mustasim by wrapping him in a carpet and having horses trample him to death, because Mongol law forbade spilling royal blood. And now his descendant was becoming a Muslim. Why? The answer isn't as simple as many think. Gazan wasn't a fanatic. He was described as extremely intelligent, multilingual, knowing Mongolian, Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Tibetan, and even European Frankish. He was interested in science, astronomy, and history. His conversion was partly political, to gain the support of Nawruz's Muslim army in his struggle for the throne. But there was also a deeper reason. Most of the population in his Ilkhanate were Muslims. If he wanted to rule effectively, he needed to legitimize his power in their eyes. But here's the strange thing. Becoming Muslim didn't stop Gazan from continuing to wage war against the Mamluks, who were also Muslims. Why? Because for Gazan, this wasn't a religious war. This was about power. The Mamluks had defeated his great-grandfather at Ain Jalut. They'd humiliated the Mongol Empire, and that was unacceptable. Moreover, Gazan had a clever theological argument. In letters to the Mamluks, he claimed to be God's chosen one, to purify Islam from corruption. He accused the Mamluk sultans of tyranny and said that God had sent him, a Mongol, to restore justice. It was a great story, and it might have worked, except for one problem. Gazan needed allies, and the only allies willing to fight beside him were the very Christians his ancestors had once protected. That's why, in the summer of 1299, when Armenia's Hethum II, grandson of Hethum I, sent a desperate message to Gazan, the Muslim Mongol emperor answered. And not just answered, He assembled one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse armies in medieval Middle Eastern history. Imagine you're a Syrian peasant in the fall of 1299, watching this army march through your village. First, you see Mongol cavalry, dark-skinned warriors with their fearsome composite bows, riding small but hardy horses. There are about 60,000 of them. Next come Georgian warriors from the Caucasus, Orthodox Christians with heavy armor and crosses on their shields. Their numbers reach 40,000. Then Armenian Cilician troops under King Hethum II, 5,000 elite cavalry, also Christian, carrying deep hatred for the Mamluks who had devastated their homeland. And scattered throughout, according to some sources, though this is disputed, are even some Templar and Hospitaller knights from Cyprus and Armenia. All commanded by Gazan Khan, a Mongol emperor who followed Islam. They're marching south with one goal: defeat the Mamluks and reclaim Syria. But for the Christians in this coalition, there's a deeper motivation. They believe, or at least hope, that if they help the Mongols defeat the Mamluks, Jerusalem might return to Christian hands. This hope wasn't baseless. Ghazan had promised in letters to Europe that if they helped him defeat the Mamluks, he'd return Jerusalem to the Christians. It was a promise similar to what previous Mongol emperors had made and never fulfilled. But for Armenia, for the surviving Crusaders in Cyprus, for those who had witnessed Acre, the last Crusader city, fall in 1291, this was their final hope. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, spent the years from 1299 to 1303 trying to coordinate with the Mongols. He tried to convince European kings to send troops. He tried to rally the military orders. He even brought a small fleet in 1300 to raid the Syrian coast, with Gazan's representative accompanying them. But Europe had forgotten the Holy Land. The age of the Crusades was over. European kings were busy with their own wars, and the Templars and Hospitallers were facing their own legitimacy and financial crises. So in December 1299, when Gazan Khan faced the Mamluks at Wadi al-Khaznadar, his coalition was mainly Mongols, Georgians, and Armenians. Western Crusaders? They were almost absent. But those who were present were about to witness an astonishing victory. December 22nd, 1299, 5 a.m., near Homs, Syria. The sky was still dark when Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad saw the Mongol coalition army forming up before him. He commanded about 20,000 to 30,000 Mamluk cavalry, the best warriors in the Middle East, the men who had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut 39 years earlier. But this time, the numbers favored the Mongols. And more importantly, this was Gazan Khan's army, not the remnant force from Kitbuka's time. The sun rose. The battle began. The Mamluks, true to their cavalry tradition, charged forward. It was a risky tactic, attacking directly into the Mongols, the masters of cavalry warfare. But the Mamluks had an advantage. Their horses were heavier, their armor thicker, and they were trained for close combat. For the first few hours, the battle seemed balanced. The Mongol forces used their traditional tactics, shooting arrows from a distance while moving, avoiding direct engagement. But the Mamluks persisted in pushing forward, driving them back. Then the Mamluk right flank, led by commanders Isa B. Muhanna and Balaban al-Tabakh, suddenly came under a devastating barrage of Mongol arrows. Hundreds of Mamluk warriors fell within minutes. Chaos began to spread, and that's when Gazan signaled the counterattack. Mongol heavy cavalry, less famous than their archers but equally deadly, slammed into the Mamluks' weakest flank. Georgian and Armenian troops joined from the sides. The battle descended into chaos. By afternoon, the center of the Mamluk army began to buckle. News of the Mongol breakthrough on the right wing spread, and in a large army stretched across the battlefield. Such news could take hours to reach other units. By the time they knew what was happening, it was too late. Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad ordered a retreat. It was the right call. Staying meant total annihilation. But the retreat quickly turned into a chaotic rout. And this is when something remarkable happened. Something that reveals the region's political complexity. As the Mamluks fled south toward Damascus, they were attacked not just by the Mongols, but by 12,000 local Maronite and Druze archers. These were Syrian locals, some Christian, some Muslim, but all hated Egyptian Mamluk rule. They saw this as a chance for independence, and they didn't miss it. The Mamluks pursued all the way to Gaza. Damascus surrendered in late December or early January. A Mongol group under General Moulay even conducted deep raids into Palestine. And this is when rumors began spreading across Europe. Jerusalem had been liberated. The Holy Land had returned to Christian hands. The Crusades had won. But reality was far more complicated. In the early months of 1300, all across Europe, people were talking about the miracle in the Holy Land. Churches held Thanksgiving prayers. Merchants dreamed of reopened trade routes. Kings began thinking about sending reinforcements. But in Syria, reality was something else entirely. Yes, the Mongols had taken Damascus. Yes, they'd defeated the Mamluks. And yes, some Mongol units had raided into Palestine. But Jerusalem? Nobody knew for sure. Some Armenian sources claimed that King Hethum II had visited Jerusalem. But no other sources, not from Europe, not from the Mamluks, not even from the Mongols themselves, confirmed this. Most likely, Jerusalem was never actually occupied. It was just a small, desolate town at the time with no strategic value. The Mongols cared about Damascus and Aleppo, cities with real economic and military significance. But for Europeans, these details didn't matter. They wanted to believe in a miracle. And for a few brief months, they did. Then it all collapsed. In February 1300, Ghazan withdrew most of his army back to Persia. Why? Some historians say it was because their horses needed fodder, that Syria had been so ravaged by war it couldn't support such a large army. Others say Ghazan received news of an invasion from the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia and needed to defend his eastern borders. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The Mongol army left, leaving only a small force of about 10,000 under General Moulay. The Mamluks, led by capable generals like Baybars al-Jashnagir, quickly regrouped. In May 1300, they counterattacked. Moulay's small force couldn't hold. They retreated. Damascus fell back into Mamluk hands. Armenia's Hethum II had been counting on Ghazan's return. Ghazan had promised to come back in the winter of 1300-1301 to attack Egypt, but he never came. In 1301, the Mongols tried again, but bad weather hampered them. In 1303, they made one final attempt, this time with a massive army of about 80,000, along with Armenian forces. This would be the decisive assault. But at Homs on March 30th, and at the decisive Battle of Shahab near Damascus on April 21st, the Mongols were defeated. This time, it wasn't a close fight. The Mamluks had learned from Wadi al-Khaznadar. They were better prepared, and they won decisively. It was the last major Mongol invasion of Syria, and when Ghazan died in May 1304, at just 32 years old, all hope for a Mongol-Christian alliance died with him. Jacques de Molay and the Knights Templar tried to hold a small foothold on the island of Ruad off the Syrian coast, hoping the Mongols would return. But in 1302, the Mamluks besieged the island. The Templars fought to the end, but finally surrendered after being promised safe passage back to Cyprus. The Mamluks broke their promise. The knights were executed. That was the Crusades' last foothold on the Holy Land mainland. Jerusalem wouldn't return to Christian hands until 1917, when the British took it from the Ottoman Empire. So did the Mongols save the Crusaders? The answer depends on how you define save. If you'd asked Hethum II in December 1299, after the victory at Wadi al-Khaznadar, he probably would have said yes. Armenia had regained lost territory. The Mamluks had been defeated. Jerusalem seemed within reach. But if you'd asked him in 1304, after the final defeat, when the Mamluks had retaken everything Armenia had lost, when Gazan was dead, when the last hope had evaporated, the answer would be different. The truth is, the Mongols didn't save the Crusades. They just gave them a brief hope, a temporary victory, a moment when everything seemed possible. But in the end, it was only a delay of the inevitable. But here's what's remarkable. In those moments in 1299 and 1300, when that multi-ethnic and multi-religious army fought side by side, they proved something important. They proved that in history, alliances don't always follow the religious or cultural boundaries we imagine. A Muslim Mongol emperor could fight alongside Christian kings against Muslim sultans. Syrian Maronite and Druze archers could attack Egyptian Mamluk troops despite sharing a religion. Because ultimately, power politics is far more complex than the simple stories we usually tell. Think about the choices these people faced. Hethum Wars in 1247 had to choose between fighting the Mongols and certain destruction, or submitting to them and having a chance at survival. He chose survival. Some call that betrayal. Others call it pragmatism. But it allowed Armenian Cilicia to exist for another century. Gazan Khan in 1295 had to choose between maintaining his ancestral religion and facing opposition from most of his population, or converting and being able to rule more effectively. He chose conversion. Did that make him less Mongol? Or did it just make him a wise leader? Jacques de Molay, from 1299 to 1302, had to choose whether to keep hoping for the Mongols' return and risk his knights' lives on the island of Ruad, or give up and accept that the Holy Land was lost. He chose hope. Did it get him killed? No. That would happen 5 years later when King Philip III of France arrested him. But did it make him a fool? Or did it make him the last man who still believed in the dream? These are questions without easy answers. And that's why this story matters. The Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar wasn't a great history-changing victory. It didn't save the Crusades. It didn't liberate Jerusalem. And just a few years later, everything gained from it was lost. But it still matters for 3 reasons. First, it shows us that history isn't a simple story of us versus them. Not Christians versus Muslims or East versus West. It's a complex web of interests, alliances, and choices made by real people in difficult situations. Second, it reminds us that short-term victories don't always lead to long-term success. Gazan Khan won at Wadi al-Khaznadar, but he couldn't sustain that victory. Why? Because strategy isn't just about winning battles. It's about maintaining what you've won, about having the resources to continue, about having reliable allies. Third, and perhaps most important, it teaches us about the nature of hope and delusion. the Crusaders in Cyprus, the Templar Knights, the Armenians. They all wanted to believe the Mongols would save them. And for one brief moment, it seemed like they might. But hope based on someone else's strength is fragile. It can vanish at any time. In the end, the Crusades didn't fail because of a lack of military victories. They failed because Europe had lost the will to support them. They failed because the local kingdoms were too small and too weak to stand on their own. And they failed because they placed their faith in a Mongol empire that was internally chaotic and couldn't commit the necessary resources. This isn't a story about betrayal, cowardice, or simple military failure. It's a story about the mathematics of power, and sometimes the math just isn't in your favor, no matter how bravely you fight. So, looking back at this story from 725 years ago, what can we learn? 1. Be careful of alliances based on a common enemy rather than common interests. The Mongols and Crusaders were only connected by their hatred of the Mamluks, not by truly shared goals or values. When Gazan decided he had other priorities, the alliance collapsed. 2. In desperate situations, people often make imperfect choices and then get judged harshly by history. Hethem, Gazan Khan, and Jacques de Molay, they all made decisions that could be controversial. But they made those decisions in the context of their time, with the information they had, facing terrible choices. It's easy to judge from history's safe distance. It's much harder to understand. 3. Military victory alone is never enough. You need political strategy, economic commitment, and the will to follow through. Wadi al-Khaznadar was an impressive military victory. But it didn't lead to anything lasting because it lacked all those other elements. And finally, 4. History doesn't always have neat endings. Sometimes the good guys lose. Sometimes hope gets crushed. Sometimes even great victories lead to nothing. But their stories are still worth telling because they teach us about the nature of human struggle, about history's complexity, and about why simple answers are rarely right. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more deep dive history stories like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And let me know in the comments. If you were Hethem II in 1299, what would you have done? Would you have allied with the Mongols and hoped for a miracle? Or would you have accepted that the crusading era was over and tried to negotiate peace with the Mamluks? There's no right answer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.